Hello, I'm Jean Meserve, and welcome to the final episode of Reimagining American Democracy. In this series, we have explored some of the challenges facing American democracy, from toxic polarization to unequal voting access to civic disengagement. We have convened experts and elected officials from all across the political spectrum to explore solutions. And we will do that again today as we talk about American democracy and its role on the global stage. It is still true that what happens in the United States reverberates across the globe. And when we are imperfect, it is not just the US that suffers. And so, is there a set of civic values that we can capture or recapture to make American democracy whole? What will it take to imagine an American democracy that actually serves all? And what will it take to get there? While owning up to challenges at home, is there a way that the US can lead globally in modeling democracy? And how do we work with our global allies to strengthen democracy here at home and elsewhere? These are some of the critical questions we'll be exploring today. Today's episode is pre-recorded, but please follow the conversation on social media using hashtag Democracy Reimagined. This series is co-hosted and made possible by a cross-partisan group of organizations, including Freedom House, the National Center for Civil and Human Rights, the George W. Bush Institute, and Issue One. The series also receives underwriter support from Norman and Karen Willocks of Compass Point Group, LLC, and the Trans-American IGON Foundation. Our media partners include Public Broadcasting Atlanta and the Atlanta Press Club. Before we begin the program, a word of welcome from the series co-hosts.
Hello, and thanks for joining us for the final episode of Reimagining American Democracy. I'm Holly Kuzmich, Executive Director of the George W. Bush Institute. I'm here with fellow nonprofits, the National Center for Civil and Human Rights, Issue One, and Freedom House, to talk about why we joined together this year to co-host the Reimagining American Democracy discussion series. For the health of American democracy, our country must come together, restore trust in our institutions and in each other, have honest and civil conversations about the issues, and take concrete steps towards building a stronger, more inclusive democracy for all. Though our views on the issues may sometimes differ, we as series co-hosts are united in the fundamental belief that American democratic ideals are good and that our pursuit of them can be strengthened, even reimagined, to form a more perfect union. Nick, let me pass it to you.
Thank you, Holly, and hello, everybody. I'm Nick Penniman, the founder and CEO of Issue One. As Holly mentioned, there's no doubt that our democracy faces more challenges today than it has at any time in our lifetimes, from polarization to civic education to disinformation to election administration. Throughout this series, we've covered these issues with the goal of both understanding the forces behind the challenges we face and, most importantly, possible solutions to those challenges. That goal has led us into some of the most important questions that we citizens can ask. For instance, what will it take to ensure everyone has equal access to the vote? How can we protect our election systems from interference? And which aspects of our democracy need to be fundamentally reimagined at this point in time? So with those very weighty questions on the table, I will turn it over to Jill.
Thank you, Nick. I'm Jill Savitt, President and CEO of the National Center for Civil and Human Rights. We have featured a diverse and cross-partisan group of speakers for this program, from leading scholars of democracy to policymakers and local organizers. Our speakers disagreed on some of the issues, but many agreed that a healthy democracy requires us not only to make our voices heard, but also to make sure everyone is included in the democratic process. We wholeheartedly agree with that sentiment. Mike, over to you for a closing word.
Thanks again, Jill, Nick, and Holly. Today's episode, the final episode of our series, aims to put American democracy in a global context. Because the United States is the oldest continuous democracy in the world, our country has long served as an inspiration for those struggling for freedom in other lands. As my co-hosts have said, American democracy is at a pivotal point today, where we really need to come together to pave a brighter path forward. And that means developing solutions and ideas of all kinds in an effort to strengthen U.S. democracy at home and to support democracy overseas. We hope you've enjoyed this series and will continue to participate in the conversation using the hashtag Democracy Reimagined. On behalf of Freedom House and our partners, I'd like to thank our moderator, journalist Jean Meserve, and thank all of you for being with us today. Thank you.
Deval, Patrick, thank you so much for joining us this morning. You were governor of Massachusetts from 2007 to 2015. In 2020, you ran for president. So you have been deep inside the democratic process, and yet you've said you're worried about American democracy. Explain.
Well, Jean, first of all, thank you for having me, and thank you and all of the organizers for putting this important conversation together. I think we have two challenges facing us in America today. One is how to make democracy function, and the other is how to make it matter. Most of the conversation has been about the ways in which, frankly, the Republican Party at the national level has led a rigging of the rules, the hyper-partisan gerrymandering, the amount of money, much of it dark, these recent rules to make it harder to register, harder to vote, harder to keep your registration, and even enabling partisan officials to invalidate a democracy. But that is all important, and we have to address that and make it easier and simpler for people to vote. But I think we also have to make it more meaningful, because I think many people have checked out and feel left out of their own political and civic lives.
You've said that every true patriot knows we cannot be great without being good. Are we good enough?
Not yet. I think that was a challenge the founders laid down. We are the only nation in human history organized around a handful of civic ideals, these ideals of freedom as made possible by opportunity and equality and fair play. And unless, in my view, we have fealty to those ideals, then we are not as great a nation as we are promised to be. And that is, to me, the essential challenge and, frankly, the essential excitement about the American experiment.
Why did this change? When did this change, in your opinion?
Well, I think we've had a struggle with that notion of the American conscience from the beginning, right? We were dedicated to the notion that all people were created equal at the very moment we were in the midst of human enslavement. We've been in this tension from time to time. And I think that our greatest accomplishments have been when we have faced those tensions and decided to choose in favor of American ideals. I think that was what the Civil War and Reconstruction was about. I think that is how we advanced our cause in the Second World War, for example, and certainly the 1950s and 60s civil rights movement.
So how do we recapture this sense of goodness at a time of cynicism, at a time of self-centeredness?
Well, first of all, I think it is very important for us to call out this sort of misidentification of liberty as sort of hyper self-centeredness. That's not it. We do have a civic space. There is such a thing as a common good, and we all have responsibility for it. There is a perennial discussion in America about the extent to which government has a role in serving or fixing this or that. That's fine, but not whether government should exist in order to help people help themselves. And I think we have to have our leaders speak to these issues of basic values, our purpose. And it's one of the reasons why I'm excited about President Biden.
In the current debate, we hear a lot about freedom. How would you define freedom?
I think freedom is about self-determination. I think that's the notion that we can do what we can to lift ourselves and our families beyond our circumstances birth. That's been my own story. That I think that's a classic American story. I think that there are ways in which, though, we have to understand that there are some things we choose to do together, and that's what we call government. The ways in which government helps us help ourselves to that American dream is, as I say, a perennial debate, and one I think we need to focus on right now.
Despite what you lay out as the shortcomings of American democracy in the current moment, you define yourself as a patriot, despite the fact that you're a Black man. Explain that.
Well, my own story is coming up, on welfare on the South Side of Chicago. I lived with grandparents who were refugees from the Jim Crow South, had come up from Kentucky in the 1930s. And though my grandmother had a third grade education, she had high expectations and high hopes for me. And America made so many of those hopes possible for me. Now, she would always say, hope for the best and work for it, right? It wasn't just about what was made available to you. You had to earn it. You had to work your way to it. But the country has, in so many ways, made my own American dream possible. I sort of feel like I owe it to her to be a patriot. But I don't think that patriotism is just about, flyovers and lapel pins and, arguments about whether football players should take a knee. I think it is about really believing and trying to live those inherent civic ideals I referred to earlier, and that the founders have referred to more than 200 years ago.
Do you think that American democracy has to be fundamentally reimagined in order to better serve all Americans?
I think it has to be rededicated, which is to say, I think we need to focus back on those core values. We have to understand that the founders themselves imagined that these principles would transcend changes over time. And as we have become a multi-ethnic, multiracial, multicultural democracy, the notion that everyone has an equal stake in our collective self-determination is incredibly important and incredibly powerful. So this is the source, I think, of both our national identity, but also our power domestically and abroad.
You worked as a young man overseas for the United Nations in Sudan. I'm wondering how that experience shaped your perceptions of American democracy.
I love that question, Jean. There's some ways in which I've found you really, when you're away and looking back at the country, especially if you're away for a period of time, and as I was living in a non-Western culture, you begin to understand that a lot of our power and influence is the power of example. The notion that we can, or we should, or we are imagined to be a participatory democracy where people can make their own way, but where they have real influence on how they are governed. And so this notion of what it actually means to be an American and what those ideals really are for and what their implication is at different times in our history, and including in my own history, I think really came home to me when I was living and working abroad. And they've become very central to how I've tried to make choices throughout my career and my life.
You've mentioned that the U.S. has been a leader of democracy across the world. I'm wondering, given the challenges that you've outlined, whether you feel we still are a leader, and how do we compare to other democracies globally?
Well, I worry about our continuing leadership. I worry about whether I've never felt that our model had to be flawless, but I do think we have to be candid about our flaws, and we have to be about trying to address those flaws. I think that is part of our strength. And I just don't think that, I guess I'd put it this way. I think great nations of great wealth and extraordinary, military might have come and gone with the winds of time. What's enduring about this nation is that we are organized around these civic ideals, and they are profoundly important and magnetic ideals. They are affirming. So when you see an attempted coup here in the United States, when you see the denial of some of the truths about our election, and really the first time, I think, in history where there was a real threat to the peaceful transfer of power, it undermines the image of America as a secure and reliable democracy. And because I do think that is foundational to our expression of power and influence around the world, I think this needs to be addressed. It needs to be resolved, and it needs to be fixed in the sense of making our democracy function. And as we do, I think we have to call to regular citizens to take stake, see their stake again in their own civic and political future, to be more engaged. And I have some strong feelings about how to do that.
Well, let's talk about that. In this age of cynicism, where a lot of people are disconnected and a lot of people, particularly young people, are disenchanted with the idea of democracy, how can you bring them back into the fold? How can you re-energize them, refocus them, and recommit them to American democracy?
So a couple of things I'd say there. First of all, I would respectfully quarrel with one premise of your question. I'm not sure it's true that young people are disenchanted with democracy. I think young people are disenchanted with politics. And a few of us old people are too, because an awful lot of it is just not about us. It's not about regular people. I used to tell my folks, my team when I was in office, I am not that interested in abstract policy. I'm interested in policy where it actually touches people. What does it do in real terms to enable people to help themselves? And I think more and more citizens are just not feeling that that our politics is about them. It's more about performance art. And so I feel very much that we should be closer to people. We should be engaged in regular and permanent grassroots engagement, community building, and so on. It's something I'm trying to do through an initiative called Bridge Together right now. Many others are engaged in this as well. It's not so important to me that it be, coordinated at the top right now, but it is important to me that it be a two-way street, not just, messaging out and so forth, but really listening and trying to pay attention to what folks are worried about and how they feel left out and left back.
So I think what you're talking about is what government can do, what politicians can do to reinvigorate democracy, but what can citizens do?
Actually, it is what I'm talking about is what citizens can do. I think, I think parties have a role to an extent, but I think the parties have to take their cues and take their leadership from people. And I think individuals and the many civic organizations that exist already, that sometimes flex up just in time for an election, then shrink down in between, they need to be to have sustained support so they can build community all of the time. And I mean community in the sense that I was raised to understand community, that you're under the jurisdiction of everybody in the community, that we have a stake in each other.
Would you say that we're at a crisis point, or at least a critical point?
I'm very worried. I do think we're at a critical point. I think that, frankly, some of the tools that were once portrayed as enabling connections to others, some of the social media platforms have in fact been weaponized as tools to divide us, and there is more and more evidence of this. How little bits of disinformation with the help of bots and algorithms and so on, all of a sudden become sources of division. And frankly, the fact that we are divided is not as worrisome as how easy it is to divide us, how much we are willing to see each other in these cartoon terms, to presume a whole set of values and ideas and prejudices and so on based on the snapshot we get in social media or media for that matter, which is why I think it's so important for us to get back personally and individually and gradually, collectively, to community and real connection with other people.
And we're out of time. Thanks so much, Deval Patrick, for talking with us today.
Thank you, Jean.
Welcome to Nicole, Cathryn, and Jan. Great to have you all with us. We've spoken a lot in this series about whether American democracy has to be fundamentally reimagined in order to be strengthened. But I'd love to talk to all of you about what the responsibility the U.S. has to model democracy abroad. Nicole, let me start with you. You have been a Foreign Service officer. You've looked at American democracy from an external vantage point. What did American democracy look like from abroad? And as a diplomat, how did you talk about it?
Thanks so much for having all of us here, Jean. I'm looking forward to the conversation. The interesting thing is, as many countries around the world have looked at the United States, I think they've recognized the truth, which is the United States does have shortcomings, like every democracy in the world. And the United States has been in many ways also inspiring for many countries. We have seen around the world, even in today, as we see courageous people in Hong Kong, they have called for the United States to step forward and to act. And when we see people streaming out of Afghanistan, they are streaming towards democracies. They're streaming towards countries in Europe and towards the United States, because they recognize that that is where that they can live more freely. I think we're in a moment now where we have the opportunity to say the United States shouldn't lead when it is perfect, because it never has been and it never will be. The United States should lead with the humble confidence to be honest about its track record, to identify where it has many shortcomings, and this series has pointed out many of them, but also to show that democracy is the system that allows us to have open conversation about those shortcomings, to have civil society engagement, to push for policy change, and that the government, through laws, through policies, will address those changes. That's the model that I'm hoping the United States will continue to put forward to the world.
Cathryn, to what extent has America's campaign for democracy been undermined by recent U.S. leadership?
Well, I do think that the situation that we saw in Afghanistan most recently, or some foreign policy decisions that have been made, certainly by the last two administrations, by the Trump administration, but then even now with the Biden administration, where consultation among democracies has not been clear and straightforward. And of course, I think what we saw over the 4 years of the Trump administration was particularly traumatic for democracies across the Atlantic, for whom American ideas and American ideals after World War II were literally foundational. And you can feel that no more drastically or more in a more rife way in Germany. The Germans felt almost personally insulted, isolated, and aggressed by a President Trump who was putting in question some of the fundamental values that made Germany prosperous and sustainable in the world after World War II. The basic foundational components of some of Germany's democratic system as we see it now, its federalism, its basic law, those are cornerstones and touch points of American ideals. And for that to be abrogated by an American president himself was difficult. And the other things are issues of policy, and as Nicole mentioned, the kind of mature discussions that we should be having among democracies, and then as it manifests in modern diplomacy. But if fundamental value questions are asked, and if America steps away from the values it sort of bequeathed on the world, then that sort of creates real dyssynergy, if you will, in the international system. And that's what we had during those 4 years of the previous administration.
Jan, would you agree with Cathryn's characterization that some of our Democratic allies have been traumatized by U.S. behavior?
They certainly have been disillusioned. I mean, the images of January 6th, of course, reverberated around the world. Many people said we couldn't believe this could really happen, even after 4 years of Trump. At the same time, I think it's fair to say that during all those years, all the talk in Europe about we finally have to get our act together, we have to be more independent, we have to create a sovereign Europe and so on, that didn't lead anywhere. And I mean, it's very unfashionable to say anything even remotely unkind about Angela Merkel these days. But, Macron reached out to her in 2017 with his big speech at the Sorbonne saying, let's build a different kind of Europe. And he never got the call from Berlin back.
Cathryn, do you want to respond to that?
Well, I do think that now there's a much greater urgency on this whole idea of European sovereignty and what we can actually do together as Europeans, and how, because of course the Europeans have been woken up from potentially their woeful naivete. I think the French approached those last 4 years of the Trump administration in a very different way. They said, look, Americans will be Americans, they will make their choices. But of course, it's true that as Jan-Werner says, the 6th of January changed that in nuance. And now the Europeans are looking down the line of the coming critical elections in the United States, 2022 and 2024. And they understand very clearly that what this is a crisis of democracy, where 2/3 of the Republicans question the democratic system and the functionality of the democratic system in and of itself. And they see that as a very dangerous moment. So what that sense of danger has done is it's pushed the Europeans to become more concrete about what they might need to do in the world to defend things like human rights, liberal order, and freedom of expression. And how that will manifest, we will have to still see. But there is more seriousness around the discussion in Europe.
Nicole, would you put the diplomat hat on once again and tell us whether you think that the United States is talking in a way it should be about its shortcomings? How do we frame this when we're talking to friends and allies?
Absolutely. I mean, I think the United States has gotten much better in how it talks about democracy around the world, in large part because it would be silly for the United States to talk about democracy without talking about the shortcomings that we saw on January 6th, the shortcomings that we see on a daily basis as we wrestle with issues of racial justice. And so I think it's really important for us to know that the United States can both speak publicly and speak about the importance about democracy around the world and speak about the shortcomings. And they're two sides of the same coin. And it would be important to not retrench into just focusing on the very needed reforms in the United States, nor should we talk about democracy outside of the United States without talking about it at home. And so we're at a point where I'm optimistic because we're actually having the conversation about the both and as opposed to one or the other. And I think what we need to also remember, and this goes back to Cathryn's point, is democracies quite often will get into pitched debates among themselves, which is extremely important. That's an element of democratic dialogue. But what we have to recognize is we can both have those pitched discussions, recognize our shortcomings, but we also have to act together as a bloc because we recognize how important fundamental democratic freedoms are, and that what's going to help us both at home and abroad move past this point in a very challenging time is going to be more democracy, more collaboration on it, rather than any of us turning inward or disagreeing on the importance of this moment and of us coming together as democracies.
Jan, do you think that the U.S. has the responsibility or right now the credibility to be modeling democracy abroad? Or should the U.S. at this point be concentrating on getting its own house in order?
Well, I think they're not mutually exclusive. I mean, you can basically even think today that despite all the criticism of sort of Biden's fashioning of a kind of global contest between autocracies and democracies, even if you're critical of the way that has been framed, in history, we can find plenty of examples where a kind of global contest has actually had good effects at home, because you basically had to get your act in order. You had to be more careful about, what you model in terms of global domestic justice, voting rights, people actually being able to be proper citizens, and so on and so forth. One footnote to the European discussion, if I may. So. When Europeans now say we have to sort of, be more active about democracy, Europe watched for 12 years, and Germany in particular watched for 12 years while Viktor Orban dismantled democracy in Hungary. And this is not like faraway country about which we know nothing or can't do anything. The Europeans could have done a lot about that, and they didn't. And it had lots of knock-on effect, because if Orban hadn't been able to do that, now Kaczynski couldn't do it in Poland. So it's another issue where you also say, look, start at home before you kind of start lecturing other people about democracy.
Cathryn, curious about your thoughts on whether the U.S. can and should be modeling for the rest of the world.
Well, I think Jan-Werner is right. And Nicole made the comment in her first statement about humility in the discussion about democracy and to take hubris out of it entirely. And I agree with Jan-Werner that, of course, and this is why this is an interesting moment, particularly in German and French politics, because we're facing major elections. And there were essentially in France also elements of the electoral race that are pushing sort of non-democratic ideas onto the French political agenda. And we see a German government that's very committed to pushing the European Union to righting the wrongs internal to, what has been done in Poland and in Hungary in pushing against the rule of law. So just a footnote on that. But I think the same thing applies here. I think with this democracy summit, it behooves the United States to come to the table in discussion around democracy with humility and with an understanding of what's at work in its own system, but then also to keep in mind how powerful it can be, because to ask big questions of one's society is something that is integral to the American experience. And so if you think about the Black Lives Matter protests, those came over to Europe. We saw Black Lives Matter protests in Europe. If you think about activism around Vietnam in the way that it influenced discussions around war and peace matters in Europe, you also saw that in Europe. So even the work that the United States does on its own democracy, and its citizens do that work with its own democracy, that too inspires discussions in Europe, for instance, or in other democracies. So maybe step off the gas to have where that's a sending message from the White House, but to see democracy at work in its best case scenario. But democracy is a living and breathing organism, and so it has both the light and the dark.
Nicole,
James, can I jump in on one point which Jan made? And I think he made a very, very important point about what we see going on in Hungary and certainly also in Poland. I would add Turkey. Obviously, it's not in the EU, but it's certainly also a close country there. But I would disagree somewhat on this idea of getting your neighborhood in order before you have conversations or engagement around the world. And the reason I am challenged by that is the United States, Germany, many countries around the world are going to be engaged everywhere in the world. They are going to do trade agreements. They're going to do diplomatic missions. They are going to have their businesses, their citizens, their NGOs, their church communities out and about around in the world. So the question is not whether any of those countries, the United States included, will be engaging in the world. The question is whether that engagement will be based on fundamental freedoms, universal human rights, and democratic values. Because as we engage in countries, we could say, well, Saudi Arabia, you're just far afield. We're going to get our own house in order, and then we're going to get our neighborhood in order, and you're far afield. So we're just going to do our business deals. We're just going to do our trade deals. We're just going to have these conversations, but we're not going to actually get into those other conversations because it's just too far, and we're working on our own issues. We are going to be out in the world. And the question is, are we going to be out in the world representing the same challenges that we're struggling with at home? Are we going to stand with the people, as we say, a summit for democracy that's happening in the United States? Are we all going to stand with people who are also for democracy, regardless of whether they're in government or not? Because we have to be reinforcing in all of those engagements, public, private, philanthropic, that these values underpin what is going on at home, and they're going to be part of the solutions that we need to be drawing on.
Jan, do you want to respond?
I agree with that as well. Just at the risk of saying the obvious, what it means to get your own house in order, or what the domestic constellations are that make you less credible, are of course somewhat different. So in the German case, it would have been relatively easy, I think, in retrospect, for Angela Merkel to simply resist, to put it bluntly, the pressure from the German car industry, which basically said, go easy on Viktor Orban because he's giving us great conditions for Mercedes, BMW, and so on. I mean, not a huge kind of obstacle to overcome in defense of democracy. The US is, of course, a very different situation. I mean, it's not that, it's a sort of problem with institutions and we can adopt some kind of technocratic mindset that if, we kind of fiddled a bit with the rule of law at home. The elephant in the room, and it's not an innocent metaphor, of course, is that in a two-party system, we have one party that, to a significant degree, is taking leave of democracy as such. And that's a very different situation from the Cold War, where for all kinds of other problems notwithstanding, you had a basic consensus around at least a couple of issues. So it's very difficult, I think, to be in a situation where your democracy promotion at the same time gets drawn into a domestic discussion where democracy itself is all of a sudden at stake, and things get recoded as partisan in a way that wasn't true in previous eras.
And I do want to pivot to that domestic situation. Nicole, what do you believe right now are the greatest challenges to American democracy?
I'll have to see how much time that we have. We have quite a few, obviously. I think Jan-Werner put his finger on a significant problem that we have, is that we've seen illiberal and undemocratic behavior coming out of the President of the United States, as well as coming out of parts of the Republican Party. I would not say the entire party, but I would say parts of it have certainly been unwilling to call out behavior which is illiberal and undemocratic. I'll name a couple challenges that we see in the United States. One is we have a conflation these days between political views and democratic structures. And we somehow have gotten to the point where we say, in order to advance my political views, my views on healthcare or immigration, I can do it at the expense of the institutions and the structure and the functioning of democracy, because that needs to produce the outcome I want. And we're somehow forgetting that democracy is just the playing field. It's just the scaffolding that allows us to advance our different views. And if we start to degrade the system, we won't even have a playing field on which we can play to advance our views. So one is that continued conflation. We see it time and time again from leaders and from other sources that are conflating those two. The second is institutional manipulation, I would say, in some places. We see it on the electoral front in a number of different states. We see it through gerrymandering. We see, again, that manipulation of that infrastructure, which is supposed to be independent, in order to produce gains which are favorable to one side or the other. I think the issue of race in the United States has from the very, very founding and prior to the founding of our nation been the sin that has been sown into the fabric of our nation. And we're in the next stage of dealing with racial conversations. And we need to just have really difficult, hard conversations about how do we ensure that we have a society where justice is meted out equally for all people, regardless of their background, regardless of their skin color, and any other demographic characteristics. So those are a few that we're going to have to wrestle with. And I do hope we can do that well, with integrity, and recognizing that it is part of an important democratic growth that any democracy has to go through to wrestle with its shortcomings.
Cathryn, would you agree that those are the major challenges? And what would you say are the conversations that need to take place? And how do we get them to take place?
So many good points in that question, but I think Nicole has done a wonderful job of summarizing. And I describe the point that she makes about institutions to underline how quickly a joint understanding of norms in public and political behavior has bled out of the skeletons of institutions. So if in fact democracy is an organism, and it needs the infrastructure of the bones of the institutions to keep it moving in the right direction, then certainly the norms are the bone marrow. And the minute you bleed the bone marrow out of the bones, they become brittle and fragile, and they put themselves up to question. So the fact that we no longer have a joint understanding as a society of what our norms really are, or that it's somehow become conflated that questioning the norms is somehow something that's laudable, and to try to bleed the logic out of the historical evolution of behavior toward one another in society. I think that's been particularly dangerous and pernicious, this sort of idea of question everything. And then that's exacerbated by, an environment in which we find our media and our interlocutors. The fact that, you win prizes by, quote unquote, by clicks or views, that algorithms manipulate the way that we consume our information and that we share information. The fact that we no longer have fundamental truths that we seemingly are able to hold on to because of this idea of questioning everything, and that our media environment feeds that we no longer have a Fairness Act as it was abrogated in the 80s to kind of meter out what's good and what's right. And so I think what you end up seeing is that our very social contract is now at play, and our understanding of fairness and equity and equality. And part of that is the sign of the times, and a good thing, as Nicole pointed out, because the United States is wrestling with the demons of its racial history, but it's not moderated in a way that you might get to what the Germans, of course, have long undergone with Vergangenheitsbewältigung, is to really look critically at the ugly past and then move that into a fabric of democracy that makes you stronger. So I think all those elements pull together to put us at a very, frankly, brittle state in American democracy.
Jan, in your recent book, Democracy Rules, you argue that uncertainty is actually necessary in a functioning democracy. What's the role of uncertainty?
So uncertainty clearly isn't a fundamental value such as liberty or equality. And especially after 2 years of pandemic, I think all of us are in need of less uncertainty in all kinds of ways. The thought about democracy is simply that it should involve the unpredictability of outcomes, that basically, as Cathryn was saying, you should have certainty about the procedures, but you shouldn't be able to know in advance who's going to win. In autocracy, it's basically the other way around. You know who's going to win in whatever, North Korea or a couple of other countries that we've already mentioned. At the same time, if the power holders feel threatened, they're always going to fiddle with the procedures in the last minute and change things in their favor. So in that sense, what has already come up as a topic for us today, gerrymandering is an example of how you take the uncertainty out of politics. You basically create situations where it's pretty clear who's going to win. And also, maybe less obviously, you're going to create situations where extremists have a much better chance of hijacking parties because, the other side has no chance anyway. So it becomes a competition for being the purest, the most authentic representative of a particular doctrine. And that's bad news for democracy as a whole.
So does that increase polarization then?
Yes, except that, forgive me, I think I have the privilege here of being a little bit less, being able to be a bit less diplomatic. So polarization, sometimes in the US context, suggests some kind of symmetrical situation where, both parties went to the extremes and can't agree on anything anymore. Yes, it's true. We now have Bernie and AOC, and we didn't have them maybe 10, 15 years ago. But there's only one party that has truly radicalized, that has truly gone off in the direction of turning against basic democratic structures themselves, and that is the Republican Party. And that didn't just start with Trump. And as has also been said before, it involved the creation of a kind of self-contained right-wing American media sphere, where those who are sort of caught in it don't even have contact with mainstream publications like the Wall Street Journal, and basically treat news as purely a matter of political self-validation. And that only exists on the right. That is not a symmetrical situation. You might have, conspiracy theories on the left, but sooner or later, people who hear about them are going to read the New York Times or the Washington Post, and they're going to have their views corrected. So it's a massively asymmetrical situation. And in a two-party system, which was long seen as a kind of guarantee of moderation, extremists can't make it in a two-party system. Once it's gotten to the point where we are, and you add in the fact that the whole institutional structure favors minoritarian rule anyway, for various historical reasons, it's really, unfortunately, pretty bad news. And it's systemic in a way that we can't simply say, it was just Trump and now he's gone, or maybe he comes back, but, it's just one individual. Unfortunately, that's simply not true.
Nicole, the name of this series is Reimagining American Democracy. Do we need to do that?
I think we need to recapture portions of American democracy, right? I don't want to say recapture all of American democracy because American democracy has been fraught with many, many problems for a long time. I think we need to reimagine what it means to be democratic citizens, little d democratic citizens, but we also don't need to reimagine democracy itself. What we need to reimagine is how America is going to work with these fundamental freedoms and these fundamental values that have existed for centuries and centuries. What this is going to require, I think, and we had a great session a great episode where you talked about civic education. We're going to have to recapture the idea that everyone has sort of multiple identities, right? And your identity can be certainly your race, your religion, many of the demographics we think about. It can be your party, but we also have one identity, only one, that we all have to buy in for this to work. And that identity is a democratic identity. Little d democratic identity. And that democratic identity is going to require us to do some of the things which Jan-Werner said, which is to also create the space for people that we don't necessarily agree with. And to know that part of the system and part of the ability for me to exercise my rights based on my faith, based on my political party, is creating the space for others to who I radically disagree with to have their space to operate. So we have to recapture and redefine that identity as our primary and our singularly shared identity, because we're battling over all these other identities. And the truth is, those identities will always coexist with each other. We will always have a multitude of races, a multitude of religions, a multitude of political parties and views. But the one that we have is the one that's based on a system that allows us to navigate that diversity without conflict. I'll just say one thing. I had an article just a week or two ago done with the Bush Institute, in which I talked about religious freedom of American society. Religious freedom is based on the idea that you're going to have people with radically, radically different views that will never, ever agree. That's the whole point of different religions. They won't ever agree. But the idea is that you create the space for all of them to coexist, and not just coexist, but we can create space for others to have their different views, but really come together around the view that we will create that space for those views to be protected.
Thank you, Nicole, Bibbins, Sedaca, also Cathryn, Clüver, Ashbrook, and Jan-Werner, Müller. Appreciate you all being with us today. Natasha Cloud and Dr. Ibram X. Kendi, thank you both for being with us here today. You're both at the forefront of the racial justice movement, and I'd like to talk about where we are and where we might be headed. Dr. Kendi, let me start with you. In October of 2020, you called the upcoming presidential election a grand battle between democracy and tyranny. Did democracy win?
I think on one level, democracy did win. I think there were certainly many candidates who were voted into office by the majority, but in many ways, tyranny won too. And I think what's happened over the last year, in which really the forces of tyranny are strengthening and are organizing and are gaining power and are suppressing votes and are distorting the truth, I think that's been happening simultaneously that we've had this movement for democracy.
So how would you assess the health of democracy today in America?
I would say it's on its deathbed. And I think we have to recognize that and save it and really fight against those who are seeking to kill it once and for all.
Mm-hmm. Natasha Cloud, you made the decision last year not to compete in the WNBA in order to focus on social justice. What was it that prompted you to make that decision?
Understanding exactly what Dr. Kendi just said. It was truly a fight for our lives as being Black and brown, and understanding my position as a professional athlete and the ability that I have to be a voice for the voiceless, to utilize my platform to, whether it be on TV or to make sure that we're shining light and shedding light on the issues that are plaguing our communities. I understood that it was a moment in time that was greater than basketball, and that I needed to use my platform in order to help save democracy. And I truly appreciate being an athlete during this last year or two, because athletes stepped up when we needed them to. There's no secret that there's a lot of distrust with our politicians from false promises and false hope. And so I thought for us as athletes to stand up on our platforms and utilize those in the best way that we can. We did a really good job. I'm really proud to call myself an athlete during this time, because like Dr. Kendi said, we saved democracy in a lot of senses, but the tyranny of it is it leaves you kind of hopeless at points, because as you're doing this work to save democracy, the forces at will are working to just continuously keep you down. And so you're just really trying to fight a beast in the lack of better terms.
Natasha, of the things you did over the past year, what would you say had the greatest impact?
Just being, for me, it's always been to be impactful means to be present. I knew with potentially going into the wobble that I wouldn't be able to be on the front lines. I wouldn't be able to be within my communities, outreaching, helping to educate, helping to give the information that is needed to not only federally save our democracy, but state and locally are just as important, if not more important, of who's representing us. So I think just my impact of being able to be in the streets, to be in the rooms that we're not supposed to be in or not meant to be in, I thought that was the most impact that I was able to have.
Natasha, as a Black woman, would you say you felt safer today than you did a year ago or not?
No, absolutely not. And that's the harsh reality. I'm playing in Jordan a month ago when the Kyle Rittenhouse case is going on. And when the ruling came, I called my wife and crying. And, it's like, how do we even think about bringing a Black child into this country with where we are today? And obviously you can hear me getting choked up, but as a Black woman, I still have the ability to be Breonna Taylor in my home right now on this discussion. I have the ability to step outside my room and be George Floyd and all the other countless lives that have been taken at the hands of those that are supposed to serve and protect our community. So there's a lot of forces working against people that look like me. And so that's why I continue to fight.
Dr. Kendi, we saw the social justice movement emerge at full strength just at the time the pandemic was also strengthening. Was there some synergy between those two events? What was the relationship?
I think it was certainly the case that because so many people were quarantining when the George Floyd murder tape circulated, we had this incredible number of people who all saw that tape at the same time. I remember one study that found, I think 7 out of 10 Americans saw that murder tape a few weeks after it happened. And so, as Natasha was mentioning, some of the other people who'd been killed by the police, we may not have as a nation all saw the evidence simultaneously. And it certainly happened last year. And then you certainly had people who wanted not just to demonstrate against police violence and racism, but wanted to be in community. And part of the reason they wanted to be in community is because they feared for their lives. And typically when people fear for their lives, they want to be in community. So I definitely think that contributed to this outburst of demonstrations, indeed one of the largest series of demonstrations in American history last summer.
As you've mentioned, police killings are what set this movement off in its present iteration. I'm wondering if you could talk to me, Dr. Kendi, about the larger goals of the social justice movement and how they relate to the big picture of American democracy.
I think that there was a time in this nation's history where the big goal was the abolition of slavery. And I think it was clear as day for many people why slavery was evil and it needed to end immediately. If there's a big goal, then it's the abolition of bigotry, or more specifically, in this case, racism. And the way we go about abolishing bigotry, abolishing racism and sexism and homophobia is first and foremost abolishing the disparities and injustices that are a window into those bigotries. And the people who are subjected to those bigotries can now feel free, really, for the first time in their lives.
We've talked a lot in this series about racial, or rather about political polarization. And I'm wondering if you think fundamentally, Dr. Kendi, that political polarization is racial polarization.
I wouldn't say it totally overlaps, but it certainly is the case that, for instance, over the last 10 years, let me just give one specific example of white Americans. Over the last 10 years, a growing percentage of white Americans who believed that white people were primarily being subjected to racism also gravitated to the Republican Party, and those white Americans who did not think that white Americans were primarily being subject to racism, and actually looked at the data that they were on the higher end of almost every racial disparity, tended to gravitate to the Democratic Party. So we're seeing that sort of polarization around that specific issue, and I suspect there are others.
Natasha, your thoughts on that, on polarization and how much of it relates to the racial divisions in the country?
It's tough because I do think that they do coexist in a lot of different ways. And I can give an example of my own family. I grew up in an all-white family. I am the only one of mixed race. And this election really drove a wedge between me and some of my siblings. And it was really, really hard to have those hard dialogues, and which led to screaming matches at points at family dinners, because for me, as a Black woman in America that also identifies with the LGBTQ plus community, I was being attacked in a lot of different ways. And this election and who we were voting for decided on if I was going to lose a lot of my rights. Little things like my wife and I had just been married. We were ready to hire a lawyer because if Trump would have come into office, our rights would have been attacked immediately. And that not only goes into our marriage, but it also goes into my wife being on our healthcare, us owning our home together, little things that people aren't even acknowledging. And so for me and my household, it did become a little bit of a racial tension in the sense of, why can't you see this? Why can't you see how much it affects me, how much it affects my wife and our relationship, and how much it will affect our future children, and which will be your future nieces or nephews. And so it's a really hard thing, but I think that race does play into it.
So, Natasha, do you think the picture will be different this year when you sit down with your family? Has the temperature around racial issues lowered somewhat now that we're in a Biden administration as opposed to a Trump administration?
It's definitely lowered because we are in a different administration, but obviously with this 2024 election coming really soon, I am scared for what's to come next. And I think a lot of people that look like me are also scared of what is to come next. Because I think in the last 10 or so years, we've taken, baby steps forward, but we've taken a lot of big steps backwards in dividing our country. And a lot of it is based off of race.
Dr. Kendi, in a recent article, you wrote about how the right wing equates anti-racism with anti-whiteness and how that's a tenet of white supremacy. What are some of the other ways that political rhetoric on the right has been transforming the United States?
Wow. I mean, where do we even begin?
You said how much time you got.
Fire away.
I think the FBI and local law enforcement agencies have been saying for years now that the greatest domestic terrorist threat of our time are white supremacists. I think that another way is just the mass distortion and the refusal to face sort of facts and to debate facts. There's this fascists in particular are focused on eliminating sort of fact and truth and mass manipulating, people, and I see that sort of emerging. I mean, we've had so many people literally be driven into, without necessarily knowing it, into a world of make-believe this year, and it's caused all sorts of political problems.
Do you see a way for us to get back to talking to one another and to stop demonizing one another?
I certainly think that we have to, as a nation, figure out how to get a hold of and regulate misinformation and disinformation. Mm-hmm. There's so many people who look at me or look at Natasha and see a problem because of misinformation and disinformation. And so how can we ensure that everyday people who look differently or who look the same are receiving truth and facts? And then how do we ensure that we have a healthy democracy where not special interests, not sort of money, but people are in power and the policies that are popular with people are being passed?
Natasha, there's been backlash recently against woke culture. Even some on the progressive side of the spectrum are voicing their misgivings about this. What does that mean for the future of the social justice movement, do you think?
I think that my generation and the generation after us, we are woke. We are woke to the miscomings, the distrust, the inequalities. We're woke to all of it, and we're not taking no for an answer anymore. And so that can be seen as rebellious in a lot of instances, and seen as a negative or a bad thing, when in actuality, we're just trying to work towards a more equitable country. And so I don't see it as an issue. Something that I'm continuously telling college students or even high school students, telling my nieces and nephews, is speak up when something is wrong, and wholeheartedly dive into that and make sure that you're educating yourself and impacting and bringing people along with you. So it's a powerful thing. I don't think it's a negative thing. So I hope people continue to be woke, and I hope people continue to wake up, because that's what's going to create the change that is necessary and needed with us moving forward.
Dr. Kendi, do you think we're seeing and hearing this backlash because people don't like the rhetoric, or do they dislike the underlying philosophy?
I think it's a combination of all those things, but I would say fundamentally that it's because people do not like the philosophy. There are unfortunately people who, because of their position of power, because of their interest, or who have been taught that somehow this is a zero-sum game. And so if certain groups get more rights, if there's equality, that somehow they will sort of lose. And so philosophically, they believe there can either be supremacy or subjection, that we can't create a multiracial democracy where every sort of racial and ethnic sort of group is valued and valued equally. And unfortunately, I disagree with that perspective, and I'm fighting to ensure that everyone can be at the table and be valued equally.
Everybody eats. Everybody eats.
Exactly.
So looking ahead, we have midterm elections coming up, and I'm wondering what you think it will take to further the aims of the social justice movement in that election. Natasha, you want to take that first?
Continuing to educate ourselves. Again, not only federally, state and locally. There's a lot of instances where we can be like, man, that was not justice. Justice was not served. But what did we do to ensure that the people that we were voting in represent us and represent what we believe in and our morals and our values and legislation that helps us progress us. So it's another task of getting out there, of educating people, of trying to bring people in, finding a commonality, and making sure that we're doing our job to ensure that democracy, carries on and carries forward. But it's tough. There's whether fighting against voter suppression, fighting against actually teaching America's true history and why we are where we are in 2021. There's little things that we need to ensure that we are doing within each and every state within this country. So it's tough, but it's just a fight we're going to have to fight.
Dr. Kendi, your thoughts on the midterms and the impact on social justice?
Well, I think that the great thing this year is there's been so many incredible voices like Natasha and so many organizations who have been sort of on the front lines trying to fight against those who are trying to harm our democracy, who are trying to suppress voters, who are trying to gerrymandering, having politicians choosing voters as opposed to the other way around. And I do think that with the election, of 2022 emerging, I think those elected officials who are currently in positions of power have to, and because we're going to continue to push them to ensure that people can easily vote sort of next fall, because it's hard, as many of these organizers say, it's hard to sort of out organize voter suppression. At the same time, I think it is important for us, as Natasha stated, to convey to the people that they have power, and that, politics is another word for power. And they need to do politics because they have power, and they need to do power because if they don't do power, then somebody's going to dominate them.
Natasha, how could American democracy better serve and more equally serve Black Americans, and how do we get there?
Oh, that's another question that I don't know if we got enough time to dive into today, but this country was built on oppressing, and that's something that we don't talk about enough. It's fully functioning as it was intended to function, and that is to keep the white status quo and to keep anyone that doesn't look or doesn't fit to that quo out. And so you can go through a whole bunch of things. I have notes here on education, healthcare, banking, housing. We can go through a whole list of things that we are systematically set up to be oppressed with. And so it's really daunting when you're looking at the whole big picture of where do we even start. But something that I've learned over the last 2 years of really diving into my activism is, okay, what low-hanging fruits can we have immediate impact on? And so I try to start at home. I try to start locally where I grew up. I try to, start in DC, educating people on who to vote for, pushing and making sure that I am in the rooms that I need to be in to, have those hard dialogues and discussions, and making sure that I'm doing what I need to do with my position to help move us forward. But there's a long list of things that America needs to do. But I think the first and foremost, we need to be truthful about our history. And by learning about our history, we will learn how to move forward.
Dr. Kendi, what do you see as the foundational values of American democracy? And do you have faith that someday it will serve all Americans?
So, I came from my ancestors who were enslaved in this country, truly believed in freedom and truly believed in equality, and have passed on to our generation this spirit of resistance sort of for freedom and that fight for humanity, that fight for human beings to be able to live in communion and to not be oppressed. At least, my ancestors, and even many white indentured servants and many women who were disenfranchised, and many people historically in this country, truly believed, in freedom and liberty and fought for it. The irony is that the history books are written as if those who were enslaving and oppressing those people believed in freedom and equality. So I'm saying that to say, I do think that there is that through line, that movement. And, I'm not sure whether it's foundational to American democracy, but I know it's certainly foundational to those people and their history.
Dr. Ibram X. Kendi and Natasha Cloud, thank you both so much for this conversation and for joining us today.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Ambassador Mark Greene, thanks so much for joining us. You are head of the Wilson Center. You've been a member of Congress. You were U.S. Ambassador to Tanzania. You were administrator of the U.S. Agency for International Development. So a lot of your work in the international arena. And given that, I'm wondering what you see as the great ideas that are foundational to America.
Well, human dignity and human liberty, the sense that the individual is at the basis of everything that we do. And that is different. That's a very different notion that we see in so many parts of the world. In so many parts of the world, it's government first, and then maybe a little bit for the individual when crises arise and emerge. But as Americans, we're constantly thinking about the importance of the human being, and that translates into our foreign policy. Related to that, I think a principal difference in the way that we do foreign policy, foreign assistance, given my background, from other countries, from Europeans, for example, is that we express values in our foreign assistance. Famously, one of our secretaries of state, Condoleezza Rice, when asked about why it was that we talked about democracy in our foreign assistance, we talked about values. She said, look, we're Americans. This is who we are. This is how our country was created. You should expect it to be reflected in our foreign affairs and our foreign policy.
So how do you see the relationship between American democracy and human rights, let's say?
Well, when it comes to American democracy and the way that we talk about human rights, what I always did when I was ambassador in Tanzania, for example, is openly admit that we're on our own journey, that we have not arrived yet. I used to say, look, I'm not saying that we in America have all the answers. I'm saying we probably made all the mistakes. And as a friend of ours, you don't have to make the same mistakes that we have made. You get the benefit of our experience. We're on a journey to a more vibrant democracy, a more human rights centered approach. And, we see that as key to success, key to a brighter future. And we'd like to walk with you on that journey.
And what about the relationship between American democracy and poverty?
Well, so I think one of the virtues of our approach to the world is that we recognize that democracy, citizen-centered, citizen-responsive governance is the only way that we can respond to challenges by reinventing ourselves and recreating ourselves and quite frankly, refreshing ourselves, our democracy and our approach. And I think as we take those issues on here at home, I think we do a better job of showing other countries how they too can reshape themselves and refresh themselves in light of challenges, in light of developments, in light of trends.
So how are we doing? How would you assess the state of American democracy today?
Well, I think American democracy is facing some challenges. We're facing political challenges, obviously everyone knows, but I think there are actually some longer term challenges that we don't talk about often enough. When you take a look at two of the broad challenges facing American families, we've got COVID and we've got climate extremes and the fallout from climate extremes. One of the problems is that both of those challenges are long-term challenges. They're not challenges that can necessarily be solved in a single political cycle. And that's a real problem. So remember, as we fight climate extremes, we're going to individual Americans and saying, look, we need to tighten belts. We need to do all of these changes, make all of these investments, behavioral changes. And if we do all of that, a few decades from now, the temperature will only go up by 1.5 degrees. That's a pretty difficult sell on a political cycle. So what we need to see more and more is political leadership that is able to talk plainly and able to involve and harness the might of the American people for the long haul and see challenges as they are. In some cases, when it comes to fighting the pandemic and being prepared for future global health challenges or the fallout from climate extremes, we need to harness people for a generational long haul challenge and be able to report back progress without sort of losing the people and in the focus that is necessary.
Well, talk for a moment, if you would, about the shorter term challenges and how those are perceived overseas.
I think, first off, I think overseas I think overseas people are in some ways confused by the challenges that they see and the political bickering that we see far too much of. They look at that as a sign of what? Hesitation. What we need to keep reminding our friends and partners and potential partners around the world is democracy is often messy. Yes, it's always been about bickering and disagreement. It has been since our earliest days. What we have to be careful of is when bickering turns into something darker, when it turns into demonization, and obviously when it turns into violence, in any sense of forgetting that we are far more united in our commonality than we are divided by our differences. But I think openly talking about the fact that, yes, we have disagreements, but reminding everybody at the end of the day, we are able to have differences because we have a system of democracy that allows for free expression. And I think that is a sign of strength. I think we believe it's a sign of strength. Sometimes I think that doesn't translate well to other countries and other cultures, and that's something we shouldn't lose sight of.
The U.S. has a long history of giving foreign aid, and you have said the purpose of foreign assistance should be ending its need to exist. Would you expand on that?
Sure. I started my career in foreign development, if you will, as a teacher in East Africa, in Kenya, in a little Kenyan village. And I tell people, as poor as people were all around me, in the entire year that I was a teacher, not one student ever asked me for money. They might ask for help with books. They might ask for extra lessons. They asked for the tools that would allow them to have a brighter future. And so I think we have to recognize that sense of dignity, that commonality. I mean, families in Africa, for example, want the same thing for their kids as we want for ours. And that's an opportunity to pursue our God-given dreams and talents, utilize those talents. And so what we should be looking to do is to help countries, help communities, help families that are willing to make the tough choices to take on those capacities and characteristics, if you will, that we believe are necessary for a more prosperous future. We should measure every program that we have. We should measure every investment we make by how it advances countries in their own journey to a more self-reliant, more sustainable future. And those that do not, those are investments that we should, quite frankly, push aside or de-emphasize.
Can you give us the historical perspective on the relationship between U.S. foreign assistance and democracy building?
So, we've always looked at the investments that we make on the foreign assistance front, on the development side, as not being sustainable unless they are accompanied by greater citizen responsiveness in governments. And it really, quite frankly, goes back to notions that were at the heart of the Marshall Plan. People often talk about taking on challenges by creating a new Marshall Plan. They sometimes forget that the Marshall Plan was not about taking buckets of money and dropping them out of airplanes across Europe. It was instead helping countries to make changes, make reforms, to do those things that were necessary to rise up and have that brighter future. And at the heart of that was citizen responsiveness, helping leaders to understand the needs and to listen to the needs of their people. So we have always seen that connection. And I think it's something that we really need to reinforce these days. These days, we know that it is not simply the relationship between government and people. It's also that there are rival approaches. We know that authoritarian-led, authoritarian-driven foreign assistance is in competition. Oftentimes, other systems provide easy money, quick cash, and they're willing to make investments in developing economies in exchange for, collateralizing assets or for making certain strategic decisions. We need to remind people that we are looking for ways to help countries pursue a democratic, responsive future, one that listens to its people and helps them to be able to take on their challenges.
So assess the U.S. involvement in Afghanistan from a democracy promotion point of view.
Well, from a democracy promotion point of view, we're obviously in the midst of dark times. I was one of those who believed that it made sense for us to leave in Afghanistan, at least for a while, a backup force that could help the government of Afghanistan as it continued to protect and develop the role of women in society and to create opportunities for young people in this wonderful, vibrant, rich culture. And I worry a great deal by what we're seeing. Nobody should have any misunderstanding. The opportunities for women are darker than they were, more limited than they were, and it is a dark phase, quite frankly, in a I think a very sad chapter.
So, your thoughts on what the next steps should be for the United States in Afghanistan?
Well, so the immediates are obviously going to be in the area of humanitarian assistance. And, we're always facing challenges in a setting like this. We don't want to do anything that provides resources that the Taliban will take for its own purposes. That obviously would be an anathema to the sacrifices made by so many for so long. And yet, as a result of the Taliban's policies, we see people who are suffering and suffering badly. So we have to find ways to meet some of these immediate humanitarian needs, but we also want to make clear that the sacrifices that were made towards a brighter future, and we should not walk away from insisting upon the recognition of the role of women and the importance of tolerance in that brighter future. So, we have a lot of work ahead of us, and it's a difficult time for the people of Afghanistan.
So, given the bumps in American democracy, can we still model democracy for the rest of the world?
We certainly can. And first off, by way of comparison, we have to realize that we still have the most vibrant democracy, the most vibrant economy. We are still the envy of so much of the world. But more than that, I think when we say model, part of the modeling must be facing up to our own shortcomings and being very open about our challenges. And where we fall short, we should tell people that we have fallen short of our own ideals. And I think when you do that, and when you do so with a sense of humility, you'll find countries around the world, peoples around the world willing to listen. Sometimes the challenges are because America seems unattainable, unreachable. We are the most prosperous country in the world. But when we remind people that we're prosperous indeed, but still imperfect and still pursuing that more perfect union, I find that audiences are more willing to listen to what we have to say.
So if you were to distill down the message that the U.S. should be sending about democracy to the rest of the world right now, what would it be?
So that democracy is still the pathway to a brighter future, and it is the way that we lift up the individual. So while democracy is under attack in some ways, and it's under attack both by the challenges that we face, these are difficult challenges for democracies, but also because there are rival systems that seek to undo democracy around the world and quite frankly, divide us. We need to be persistent in talking about that notion of a more perfect union, that we're on a journey, that we haven't arrived yet, but we will walk with anyone who's willing to pursue that same journey.
Ambassador Mark Greene, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
For our next conversation, please welcome Khaled Pitts. He's Vice President of Policy and Programs at FairVote. Also, Ensei Ufat, founder of the New Georgia Project, and also Lee Drutman, Senior Fellow at New America. Thank you all for being with us. In this series, we've talked a lot about how to ensure that everybody has a voice in American democracy. We've also talked a lot about the polarization in American politics. And I'd like to talk to each of you about ways we can actually take action to address those problems and say, what do you right now see is the greatest challenge to American democracy?
I think the greatest challenge to American democracy in this moment is the sort of lack of willingness of our current leaders to, one, communicate honestly about the threat to American democracy, the sort of bad actors that are intent on attacking our elections infrastructure. And those bad actors are both foreign and domestic. And so the threats themselves, the attacks themselves are problematic for sure, but we have the tools to address them. But when we have leaders that aren't even willing to acknowledge the problem, then we find ourselves in an existential crisis space. They say you cannot fix what you have not faced. And so those who are in charge of executing on US domestic policy are failing us in this moment. And that is our greatest challenge.
Lee, you've identified the two-party system as being a challenge for American democracy. Would you explain that?
It is. Well, if we think broadly, democracy is a system in which parties lose elections. And there is a fundamental basis for democracy, which is that we have elections that are free and fair and legitimate, and that the losers dust off their sleeves and accept those losses and then move on and offer new ideas and new policies in the next election. We have fundamentally lost that. And we've lost that because the Republican Party has been taken over by a liberal authoritarian movement that is unwilling to acknowledge the ability to lose. And that is a threat. Now, in my analysis, that threat follows directly from the way that our two-party system has organized our political coalitions and how they've reinforced the divisions of cultural and ethnic and geographical differences, and created two roughly equal coalitions that see each other as the threat. And I mean, I do think there is some symmetry here, but also some very important asymmetries here, in that the Republican Party has veered into deeply liberal territory. And I mean that on two levels. One is the sort of anti-democratic tendencies, but also the anti-pluralist tendencies of the Republican Party, that if we have a liberal democracy, it means that we have to treat every voter equally and consider everybody's rights and values as equal. And what the Republican Party has done is it's embraced this very revanchist view of America in which only certain people count. And that has become a deep and existential threat to our democracy right now.
Khalid, your organization, FairVote, has tried to improve representation in American politics. One of the things that you've advocated for is the Fair Representation Act. Tell us what that is and what it would do.
Well, I think the two fundamental elements of the Fair Representation Act, I would say, would be proportional representation. My organization, we champion policy called ranked choice voting, where voters get to rank their candidates order of preference. Proportional representation is a form of ranked choice voting, and where those candidates are sort of ranked proportionally instead of a winner take all measure, which we have right now. We feel like it was, you asked earlier to say about the fundamental problems with some of our democracy. We feel that both the partisan politics, the hyper-partisan politics that we see right now, which has really sort of infected the voters, really left people feeling disenfranchised, unrepresented, and you've seen acts of acting out, whether that's sort of ingrained in terms of with themselves, or been fomented by those who Lee will talk to, and particularly right now in the part of the wing of the Republican Party, to sort of foment action around that. We believe that through ranked choice voting, proportional representation, and creating multi-member districts and getting away from the sort of winner-take-all single-member districts is a way to fundamentally change not only policies that we all work on, voting representation, but also voting access, I should say, but also representation in Congress.
Khalid, could you dig down a little bit on ranked choice voting and how exactly that works for those who don't know the phrase?
Sure. And it, simply put, if you have a number of candidates, multiple candidates, simply if you can choose, you can rank your candidates in order of preference. So simply if your first choice doesn't meet that threshold to win, then your vote would transfer to your second choice, and so on and so forth, to ultimately a winner would be chosen for that election. It's the fastest growing nonpartisan voting reform in the country, with over 50 states and jurisdictions and 10 million voters. New York just came online this past year. It allows more choice for voters. It eliminates strategic voting, we say, and fears about spoiler candidates. And, think about Ralph Nader and Ross Perot in past presidential elections. But we feel like it compels candidates to run more civil campaigns, but it also compels those candidates to seek broader array of support. And for someone who is of color, we feel like it levels the playing field to allow more women, people of color, and others from diverse backgrounds the chance to win.
So Lee, let me ask you, how would ranked choice voting and also the Fair Representation Act, how would those impact the two-party system in your view?
Well, the key part of the Fair Representation Act is proportional multi-member districts. And the reason that we have just two parties is not because Americans want just two parties, is because as long as we have single winner districts, only two parties can effectively compete. Also, the single winner district, I think as we are watching the redistricting cycle and the sort of intense, aggressive gerrymandering happening, particularly in Republican states, the tool of gerrymandering is the single member district. So if you get rid of the single member district, do proportional multi-member districts, gerrymandering goes away. So if you want to have more parties, you just have larger districts. This is not rocket science. It's basic election engineering 101. Larger district sizes with proportional representation mean more parties can compete for representation. Also means that every vote counts equally. Right now, most voters live in uncompetitive districts. Many live in uncompetitive states. And where their votes are essentially taken for granted. Parties don't need to mobilize voters. Voters feel disempowered because it's the same person in office year after year. It doesn't matter whether they vote or not. So what you see with proportional multi-party systems throughout the world, the U.S. is really the only major democracy with a two-party system, as you see broader political participation, every voter counting equally, parties competing on policy. And most importantly, you see that in comparable countries with similar levels of education and values and economies, is that the far-right parties, although they exist, they are on the margins. The far-right party in Germany only got about 10%. You look across Western Europe, the governing coalitions are repeatedly formed without the far-right party. It's only in our system in which a plurality, which is a minority of this country, can take over the entire country by taking over one of the two major parties.
So do you think then that ranked choice voting and the other aspects of the Fair Representation Act would help detoxify American politics?
I think the combination of ranked choice voting and multi-member districts would detoxify American politics. If you look comparatively again, and I think it's important, the U.S. is not the only democracy in the world. What you see in other democracies with multiple parties is that politics is just a lot less toxic, because there's something about the binary condition of us versus them, which leads people to demonize the other. People are geographically segregated, informationally segregated in our two-party system, and there's a fear-based campaigning that happens in this system of negative polarization, in which leads people on one side to see the other side as different, scary, and the idea that if they just win 51% of the vote, they will get total power. I mean, this is the story that Republican voters are being told over and over again. If we lose, this will be the end of our country.
And say you're working to register and engage voters. And I'm wondering if you think these changes, were they to be more widely instituted, would that help you in your effort?
I think that those changes would certainly help in our effort to have a more active and informed and confident electorate that is, representative, that includes young people and people of color and new Americans. What I would say, though, is that those interventions, those reforms are absolutely necessary, and they're wholly insufficient. That we're talking about America, the United States of America. So we're talking about the toxicity. It's inside the house. It's not just in our elections, it's in our rhetoric around, it's our culture. And so as we're thinking about, representation, as we're thinking about the ways in which, our diagnosis of problems for our country and problems for American democracy, if we are not analyzing those problems and then developing solutions with a race, a gender, and a class lens, like expressly, and understanding how those things impact how people participate in our elections, and understand how those things help us identify what the priorities are for the parties, I just think that we are, still moving, we're still working at the margins, right? That when I look at something like a place like Georgia, right? Like one of the things that's unique about the state of Georgia in this particular moment as it relates to democracy is how quickly the demographics of the state are changing. By 2024, 2025, white people are going to be the minority. White folks are going to be the minority in Georgia. There will be a plurality. So first state in the deep South where white folks are not the majority. And like, what is that going to mean for our elections? So even if we found ourselves in a policy environment where there was ranked choice voting in Georgia, it would not in any way address the widespread, well-funded, aggressive voter suppression schemes that we see in our state. The massive purges from people off of the voter rolls, the closing and consolidation of polling locations in key communities where the demographics are changing or where African Americans voter participation is increasing. And so again, those reforms absolutely important, right? Necessary, but insufficient on their own.
Khalid, let me go back to ranked choice for a moment, if I could. Can you give me an example where it has done the things that NSA would like to see, where it has actually increased participation in the process?
Well, I think you look at participation both with respect to, in any functioning democracy involves two things, at least two things. It involves voting and representation. And so just as what NSA was saying, that if we're going to strengthen our democracy, we need to develop a comprehensive package of election reforms, whether they're around voting access or voting reforms. Think about the power of that ballot, having a voter having access to the power of that ballot. And then what does that ballot do? And I'll give an example, and we need a comprehensiveness of it. And, something Lee and I talked about with proportional representation. If you look at, I'll use Georgia as an example, typically in runoff elections, 30-40% of the electorate drops off that second election. Most of that electorate are people of lower economic status, people of color, people who don't have the ability to take time away from their jobs, maybe get somewhere for their kids to be able to go vote. Polling stations, NSA can talk about the lack of polling stations that they have access to. But if you look at just using ranked choice voting, as Lee said, it's only a piece of reform. And I think both Lee and I would argue and agree with and say there's both the front end aspect of having access to the ballot, and then once you cast that vote, how is that vote being counted? Let's just say. And with respect to ranked choice voting, it was a Herculean effort by NSA and others to turn out voters not only for that first election but for the second election in Georgia. And the result is we see a change in Georgia electing someone of African American descent for the first time. Just the Atlanta election they just had in Georgia, I think there was a 20% drop off from the general election to the runoff. And so we think ranked choice voting can be a piece of the puzzle, not the whole puzzle.
And say, I'd like to talk a little bit more about how to motivate people to participate. You talk about super voters. Tell us what they are and how you create them.
Yeah, that is definitely how we talk about our work internally. As one of our goals is to help create what we call a whole new generation of super voters. And these are people who vote in every election in which they're eligible. So when we think about super voters, we think about senior citizens. And I think, quite frankly, Black women in this country are the two demographics that immediately pop to mind when I think about people who are going to show up and vote for a school board race, like a school board levy, special elections. And so we spend a lot of time thinking about what is it that our grandparents know and what is it that Black women know, that despite sometimes evidence to the contrary, that they see voting as an important part of bringing about the change that they want to see. Because our research has showed us that, when we look at the turnout of young people and new Americans and why the reasons that people give for not showing up, oftentimes it is just lack of familiarity with, one, the process itself, two, that fact that whether or not there's an election actually happening, and three, whether or not, what the impact of voting in this election will have. So what does a city council do? What is a water and sewage levy? Why does my vote matter? And what impact is it actually going to have on my life? So when they are making those sort of cost benefit analyses, that opportunity cost, like to take off of work, to go vote for this particular election, what impact will it actually have on the life that I have? And so we are constantly asking those questions and trying to develop high impact, high quality messaging as a part of our popular education efforts, so that it's not something like inherently unreliable about young people, although we do have our Gen Z jokes, that it is more often a lack of familiarity with the process and whether or not there's an election, and again, why it matters for them. And so we seek to make interventions in those areas. Like, how do we cut through the noise of misinformation and disinformation that we are increasingly seeing, but also just the noise of all of the other things that are competing for the hearts, minds, attention of the constituents that we organize with every day.
Lee, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh, no, INSEE was very much talking about impact. I think, and we were talking about ranked choice voting and its impact. I don't think there was a more clear example of how ranked choice voting could have an impact. And when voters go to the polls, they want to see an impact. New York City, for the very first time, has a majority female city council and has elected, for only the second time in its long illustrious history, its second Black mayor. That was largely because of ranked choice voting.
Lee, many people are deeply wedded to their parties and their philosophies. Do you think it's even possible for them to embrace a system that would be less partisan?
I think absolutely. I think if you look at polling, 2/3 of Americans say we ought to have more than just two parties. When you look at how people identify themselves, almost half of people choose to identify themselves as independents, not Democrats or Republicans. And particularly Gen Z is really fed up with both parties. I mean, what they see in both parties is a gerontocracy of, people who don't really care about the issues that young voters care about, and are not doing anything on climate, and are not doing anything on racial justice. And these are the issues that are motivating young voters, and they're deeply disappointed with the leadership. Certainly of the Republican Party, but also the Democratic Party. So I think there's tremendous hunger. One thing that I did earlier this year is I worked with the New York Times to develop a quiz of, if America had 6 parties, where would you be? And one of the things that struck me was how quickly people embraced that idea, and how many people were sharing their results and encouraging other people in their friend and family network to also see where they'd fit. And people sort of immediately found themselves identifying with these new parties that I just kind of made up out of whole cloth. So I think there's a deep sense that neither the Democratic Party or the Republican Party represents a lot of voters, and that people would like to feel like they are part of a party that really represents them, and that they can vote for those candidates of that party and have an impact no matter where they live. I think there's tremendous hunger for that in this country.
And we have to leave it there. Lee Drutman, Nsé Ufot, and Khaled Pitts. Thank you all for joining us today. Anders Fogh Rasmussen, thank you so much for joining us today. You have in many ways dedicated your career to strengthening democracy as Secretary General of NATO, Prime Minister of Denmark, where you played a key role in building out the EU membership. You currently lead the Alliance for Democracies and also the Transatlantic Commission on Election Integrity, which I should say I'm also a member of. Let me ask you first, why democracy? Why does the world need it?
We need democracy, we need freedom, because that is a model that produces best life opportunities for all people. And I think deep inside all human beings, there is a clear desire to make your own decisions on your own life. You don't want anyone to decide on your behalf. That's why we need freedom and democracy.
Democracy is eroding in many countries. What do you think the causes are?
Well, according to Freedom House, the Economist Intelligence Unit, and other think tanks, we have seen a decline in freedom and democracy for the 15th consecutive year. Why is that happening? I think, firstly, our own complacency. After the collapse of communism, after the end of the Cold War, we who are living in free societies took our liberal democracies, we took freedom and democracy for granted. And we let the autocrats advance. But secondly, we have also been under pressure from outside. We have seen more assertive autocracies, China, Russia, other autocratic systems and dictatorships. They are threatening our security. They are spreading disinformation. They are trying to destabilize democracies. And finally, we have also seen some backsliding in our own societies, which in a way is due to the fact that democratically elected leaders have not addressed legitimate concerns by their peoples appropriately and effectively. These are at least some of the reasons.
What concerns are you talking about? Where have the democracies failed to address their own citizens' concerns?
There are several areas, but let me highlight two. Firstly, to the benefit of the whole globe, we have seen globalization. Hundreds of millions of people have been taken out of poverty, has now joined the middle class, so to speak, not least in China, thanks to globalization. But that has been at the expense of many, in particular, blue-collar workers in our societies, and they feel left behind. That's one issue that has not been addressed properly and effectively by our democratically elected leaders. Another issue is immigration, illegal immigration. Many people feel threatened by illegal immigrants, and I don't think that democratically elected leaders have addressed that issue effectively either.
Do you think that fundamentally democracy still works, or does it need to be reimagined, revamped?
They work, absolutely. I think freedom is the strongest force on earth because freedom creates entrepreneurship, it creates new inventions, it creates better life opportunities. So freedom is the strongest force we have. So freedom will survive, but we cannot take it for granted. This is the reason why we have to, I would say, make our own democracies more resilient. This is the reason why I appreciate the Biden administration's effort to rally the world's democracies around certain principles.
So historically, the United States has led the world's democracy, but its democracy ratings have declined, and that was even before the events of January 6th. Should the US still be, can the US still be the global champion of democracy?
Yes, indeed. Of course, we have all followed the events in the US on 6th of January, et cetera. But on the other hand, look at this from a positive perspective. It has also demonstrated the resilience and the strength of American institutions. I think the American democracy has lived through ups and downs during a couple of centuries and survived. And for me, the US is still the shining city on the hill. Why do you think that so many people would like to go to the US and create a new life in the US? Of course, that is because of the strength of the American democracy.
But have recent events changed the relationship between European democracies and the US?
Well, during the last 4 years, to be very honest, during the last 4 years under the Trump administration, we have seen divisions between Europe and the US. Not only because of the harsh rhetoric from President Trump himself, but also because of an increasing doubt in Europe about American global leadership and American commitment to helping Europe when it comes to security, economy, etc., etc. When Biden was elected, his first declaration was, America is back, and his first foreign travel went to Europe. We were all relieved. But since then, reality shows that also the Biden administration is pursuing, maybe not when it comes to rhetoric, but in reality, certain policies that are similar to the previous Trump administration. And all that has created a debate in Europe about what has been called European autonomy, the capability of Europe to act on its own without being reliant on the US.
Given that fact, do you think that the democracies of the world can still work together to promote this form of government?
Not only do I think we can, but we should, we must. work together. Together, all the free societies in the world together represent more than 60% of the global economy. That represents a formidable force. And if we put more pressure on China, on Russia, on other autocrats and dictators in the world, then we can counter their assertiveness and push back on the advancing autocracies. That will create some respect in Beijing and elsewhere.
So what should the first priority of this alliance of democracies be?
First of all, I appreciate the Biden summit on democracy that will be followed by a new summit next year. I don't see this as a one-off event, but as a start of a campaign for democracy during the coming year. By the way, each and every year since 2018, we have organized the Copenhagen Democracy Summit. We will do that also in 2022, exactly half a year after Biden's virtual democracy summit in Washington. And I hope the Copenhagen Democracy Summit could serve as a stock-taking summit. And the first priority for an alliance of democracies would be to strengthen the economic alliances among democracies. We have seen how China has exercised economic coercion against Australia, against Lithuania. They have singled out individual countries, put pressure on them economically. I think we who are living in democracies, we should help each other. We should introduce what I call an economic Article 5, inspired, of course, by my previous position as Secretary General of NATO, where we have a military Article 5 that states an attack on one is considered an attack on all. Exactly the same in the economic field. If one democracy is attacked by China economically, then we should help that country. We should agree on free trade agreements. We should provide credit facilities to help that country.
You mentioned technology when we were discussing why democracy had eroded. What should this alliance of democracies be doing to mitigate that issue?
The alliance of democracies should be a leading force in setting global norms and standards for the use of emerging technologies. Take, for instance, artificial intelligence. It can be used to make our lives much, much easier. But it can also be used to control and monitor the population. And that's exactly how they use artificial intelligence in China. So if China is winning the technological race, then they will be setting the global norms and standards for the use of artificial intelligence, information and communication technology, etc. That mustn't happen. So that would be another important element in an alliance of democracies, to be setting global norms and standards for use of emerging technologies.
What is one thing that individuals or organizations or policymakers could do to strengthen democracy, either at home or abroad?
First of all, I think we should keep sight of the big picture. One of the strengths of a democracy is our ability to have open and critical debates on everything. But that shouldn't be, we shouldn't make any mistake, because it's a strength, but it can also be considered a weakness. But we should not consider that a mistake. We should keep sight of the big picture, leave all the details aside, and join forces I think as a point departure, we could consider around 110 countries in the world out of a bit less than 200 countries as free or partly free societies. Let's not go into details on how we will define freedom and democracy, but let us join forces and counter the advancing autocrats in a much stronger way and realize that democracy can have different faces, but there are certain principles that are basic principles. In a democracy, you have free and fair elections. You base your society on the rule of law, free speech, protection of minorities. But of course, it can be done, it can be implemented in different ways, but the basic principles should be kept inside.
Given all the challenges that you've laid out, would you say you're optimistic about the future of democracy or not?
Basically, I'm optimistic, but I have learned lessons like most other people, namely that the optimism we all felt after the collapse of communism, the end of the Cold War, could not be interpreted as a given thing that democracy, freedom and democracy will survive. Each generation had to fight for freedom and democracy. So I'm optimistic because I do believe that freedom is the strongest force in the world, but we have to fight for freedom and democracy each and every day.
And we'll have to leave it there. Anders Fogh Rasmussen, thank you so much. And that concludes our final episode of Reimagining American Democracy. Thank you all for participating. Thank you also to our guests, our co-hosts, our underwriters, and our media partners for supporting this enterprise. Our hashtag is Democracy Reimagined. And if you'd like to learn more about the series or catch up on previous episodes, visit reimaginingdemocracy.org. I'm Jean Meserve. Have a great afternoon.